we move on now to our next presentation, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar from University of Louisville, and he will be talking about environment research. Dr. Bhatnagar has been working in this area for the last more than 2 decades, and he will give his perspective on the environmental science research and also share some of the activities.
I would begin by pointing out that way in the 1990s, we did sort of sequence the human genome, but the human genome is only part of the problem or part of the solution. What we really need to know is the way the genes interact with the environment, and so that we can only know or if we can understand what the environment is and how the environment functions and how it is actually operating. So that way we would be able to understand if there is any relationship between the environment and the genes. So what we started off was we call the Envirome Project, and the project is to understand the complexity of the human environment and how it relates to a specific human genetics. We do know that the human environment is complex. It has multiple components. It has oh great, we have the slides on. So if you can go to the next one, it shows that we have this is about the human genome. The next, please. These are the genes and the environment. They interact, so that we need to know both the genome and the environment. The next slide, please. This is the a slide showing that the human environment is complex and that it has multiple components. If you switch to the next slide, please. The next one. So we think the environment is a complete set of natural and social and personal conditions that shape the health of an individual. It has many components. It has a natural component, which is the world outside, the cycles of night and day, the seasons, as well as other components. Next slide. And so it would. There are many components of the natural environment that affect human health. For example, there is the location, the altitude, latitude, and longitude, and these affect human health, as well as things like sunlight, temperature, and rainfall, and seasons. It also entails features of geology and pollutants like dust and sand. And it is becoming increasingly evident that these different components play an important role in regulating the risk of disease and in imparting health. In particular, there's evidence that exposure to green spaces is conducive to cardiovascular health, and people who live in green spaces are healthier and live longer than people who are not living in green spaces. The next slide, please. And so we also know that there are other components of the environment that affect the risk of heart disease and other chronic diseases. And these could be the altitude and the longitude. If you can switch to the next slide, that those also play an important role. So in order for us to be able to consider what is it that affects human health, we need to incorporate all of these different parameters in human health and be able to understand human beings as part of this geological, ecological system that they exist in. And there are very strong links. We know that people live in high altitudes have a different risk of heart disease than people live in lower altitudes. We know that people who live near the equator have lower blood pressure than people who live away from the equator. And so all these things need to be considered in trying to put together the human genome. Next slide, please. And so what we can do is that if we can sort of collect all the data that is with all these different parameters, then we would be able to actually sort of put back together the different components of the human environment. Next slide, please. It is so in addition to the natural environment, we also have the social environment. And the social environment, if you can see on the next slide, is again a very complex milieu of the social networks, our position in society, what we know as the social determinants of health. And these different sort of components of a social environment, such as our socioeconomic status, make a huge difference. So certainly people who are have more wealth and people who are have a higher socioeconomic status do better. But we're also influenced by social networks. We know that we are part of this complex networks, and our disease risk actually varies with the type of social network that we exist in. So in order to understand what human beings can sort of what risk of disease they do and how much they would thrive would depend upon these type of social environments or the social networks that they are a part of. Next slide, please. And so within these social networks, we also have created our own personal environments. And these personal environments are the environments that we populate by the choices we make. And so as shown in the next slide, please, that we would see that there are different components of a personal environment. And this environment is characterized by the type of houses we live in, the type of family and friends we have, and a close approximate people, the sort of built environment that we are in, all the areas that we live in, but also within these areas, the levels of air pollution and other pollutants that are in our environment, which needs to be considered in terms of evaluating health and in terms of assessing the actual environment that an individual lives in. The next slide, please. And so we also would be able to then understand what are how these different components impact the risk of disease, and that can I have the next slide, please? So would therefore has to be integrated. So these are very complex, large data sets that actually are describing different varieties of social organization, the natural world, as well as the different sort of exposures that individuals are in. And as I was talking about that, how we need to understand not only the health impacts of these different components, but also the interrelationships. So we need to be able to gauge and understand what these different influences may be. Can we move it to the next slide, please? I think we're stuck with this. But regardless, so if we are going to be seriously considering the effect of the environment, then we would have to have these multiple types of characteristics and multiple types of exposure that we need to take into account. So in order to sort of do that, we have sort of launched a couple of different projects to sort of operationalize this idea of the environment. And in these projects, we are trying to understand what difference would it make to the health of an individual if we were to change some components of their environment. And so one of those projects is what we call the Green Heart Project. And in the Green Heart Project, we are looking at how planting trees would change the risk of a disease in a community. And for that, we have started what we call a sort of a natural clinical trial, or community-based clinical trial, in which we are going to plant mature trees to be able to see how that change in the natural environment affects the risk of heart disease in a specific neighborhood. And then whether this is mediated by changes in air pollution and so on. So what the idea would be that we would gather a comprehensive data set that describes not only the ecological conditions, but also we can then be able to understand what it would be that the natural environment is affecting human beings or the people living in that particular neighborhood. Just 1 minute, I'm trying to see if I can move my slides. Is there a button, Paul, somewhere that I can move?
No, you're actually, I can advance them for you, but you're on they are advancing. So right now I have you on the green heart Louisville one.
Oh, for some reason I don't see that, but anyway. Um, so what happens is then we would be able to assess what the role of the natural environment is and how it would change the way people are exposed to air pollution. It could also change the way in which it would help us understand how we could design sort of neighborhoods which would be able to then tell us that whether or not there are higher levels of air pollution or not in a particular neighborhood. So with learning from that, we would then be able to sort of understand how what the effect of neighborhood greening is, and, uh, and how it impacts the social structure of the place as well. So can you move to the next slide?
Mhm.
And so we have collected a lot of data, and this is one of the data sets showing our this hyperspectral image of the area, so we can account for every tree in the area and to look whether they are stressed or not. Again, this requires a lot of computing. We also need to calculate what the actual greenness index is of that area. We need to calculate what the biomass is in the area, and so that when we plant trees, we'll be able to tell what the differences it might make. This is an example of our attempt to understand the spread of air pollution in the area, and we have actually have mobile air monitoring that we go around this area, and you can see that the places where it's red are the places where there's higher levels of air pollution versus where it's green or yellow, the lower levels of air pollution. So knowing this sort of picture, we would then be able to judicially plant trees at those areas so that we would be able to maximize or optimize the effects of greenness in this neighborhood. Next slide, please. And then we would be able to understand what are the different sort of matrices in greenness, and these are very large data sets. Again, looking at the greenness of the different areas. These are aerial images, they're hyperspectral and lidar. As shown in the next slide, can you go to the next one? We have to transform these images into actual point clouds, and then be able to then calculate what is the mass of greenness in the area and into our target areas, the T1, T2, which is the areas where we will plant trees, compared to the control areas, we will not plant trees, and see what the difference is in the extent of greenness. And so that requires a whole sort of different type of computing, and then sort of collecting and putting it together with the local air pollution measurements, which we do with the actually sites that are that are localized, and we continuously collect air pollution, and that relate that to the changes in the mass. So once we know all of this, we go to the next slide. What we plan to do is to plant large trees, and then be able to tell whether or not these trees would make a difference. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what after doing that, we would be able to then assess what is it that's happening within the neighborhood, and whether or not the greenness would make any difference. So in order to sort of compute all of this, we would have to develop a very comprehensive understanding of the cardiovascular health of the people, which we have done in a baseline exam that was conducted last year. Unfortunately, because of COVID this year, we couldn't repeat the exam. We might have to get another baseline next year. But the overall idea is that we get a comprehensive view of the cardiovascular disease risk in the community by a whole range of parameters, and then be able to tell what difference that would make. So next slide, please. And then after we sort of do this, after sort of getting a baseline exam, putting the trees, and then coming back and then reevaluating what the changes may be, then we might be able to tell whether or not that there is any difference that the greenness has made. So that would, of course, be like a classical before-after sort of evaluation, and lead us to a better understanding of what the effect of the environment may be on individuals, and what the environment how the environment changes with the natural environment. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we are planning to do, is actually within this area recruit a group of people who would be then we can follow in depth, and that we have them wearing what we call an exposome meter. And this exposome meter is something that would collect a lot of different biologics that people are exposed to, or different chemicals they might be exposed to. And we call this the longitudinal evaluation of environmental cardiovascular risk. The next slide lists the actual the parameters that we plan to measure. And again, that generates a lot of data, and then we would be able to, from this data, learn how different exposures are being are affecting the cardiovascular responses and cardiovascular health. And again, this requires a lot of big data set. We need to be able to identify about 1,500 to 2,000 different species of bacteria, fungus, virus, and plants, over 3,000 different chemicals that are captured in this particular device. We also want to look at the transcriptome analysis and how the gene expression is changing. And then we also look at concurrent changes in the outcomes, which is the biology of the individual relating to changes in blood pressure, heart rate, and ECG, and how that affects your immune function. So as you can see, that these are various biological outcomes that in itself are very large data units, but we are a bit more ambitious than that. We want to actually understand the environment of these individuals in great detail, to be able to document the level of their sleep, the physical activity, as well as the social ties and cognition. We're trying to trace out the social networks and how people in different social networks respond to different exposures. So therefore, we need to look at a variety of data sets, which include not only data sets that have to do with the natural environment, the greenness in the area, the tree canopy, the leaf area index, but also biological characteristics like blood pressure, heart rate, and so on, as well as the wide range of exposures, and relate them to the entirety of an individual's genome. So with that sort of a long-term plan, we are going to proceed in steps. And I think that would be great if we could sort of think about and partner with the right people who have the right expertise to help us sort of get through this large, which I believe is not just a data gathering exercise, but a first attempt to be able to grasp at the complexity of the human environment.